Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're undertaking a monumental task. We're tearing through over 2,000 years of history, law, and philosophy to identify a single terrifying pattern of power.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We're asking what happens truly when the state decides its biggest enemy isn't some external threat or even internal corruption, but human conscience itself.
It's a crucial question, I think, because every civilization, really regardless of its political structure, be it an ancient kingdom, a sophisticated democracy, or a modern judiciary, has faced this moment of truth.
That moment of truth.
Yeah, and our source material today connects three pivotal, deeply resonant moments. They span different civilizations, different millennia, but they're all united by one really tragic thread. The moment powerful institutions chose to punish conscience instead of corruption.
That phrase is so powerful. Punish conscience instead of corruption. That is, that's the ultimate ethical indictment of a state, isn't it?
It is. It's the breaking point.
We're looking at what happens when that moral duty to speak truth, to dissent, collides head-on with the political demand for absolute obedience. And to do this, we are analyzing the stand of Imam Hussain, the trial of Socrates, and the judicial collapse in Pakistan in 1958.
Exactly. We're studying Karbala in 680 CE, where constitutional refusal led to martyrdom. Then we jump back to Athens in 399 BCE, where philosophical critique was basically declared a capital crime.
By a democracy, no less.
By a democracy. And then forward again to Pakistan and this legal mechanism, the Doctrine of Necessity, which validated a military dictatorship. And it just hollowed out a modern constitution.
That is a staggering range of time and context. You've got Islamic constitutionalism, ancient Athenian democratic law, and then a 20th century geopolitical failure. So the big question, the mission for this deep dive is what universal principles about the limits of power, the necessity of dissent, and the true source of legitimacy emerge when we place these wildly different events side by side?
That's the core question, right? We're looking for that common behavioral instinct that runs through state power when it feels threatened by integrity, by truth, by genuine intellectual freedom.
And what is that instinct?
Well, the state, at the end of the day, seeks continuity. It seeks conformity. And when an individual's conscience breaks that continuity, the state has a choice. It can either reform or it can eliminate the threat.
And in all these cases?
In all these cases, they chose the latter. Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the earliest and, you could argue, the most constitutionally profound crisis in this collection.
Let's start with the stand of Imam Hussain ibn Ali in 61 AH, which is 680 CE. The source material frames this very definitively, not as, say, a family feud or some personal theological dispute, but as a defining constitutional moment, a moment that fundamentally altered the trajectory of Islamic governance forever.
Right. And to really grasp the magnitude of this, you have to understand the seismic shift that was happening in the nascent Islamic State. This wasn't that long after the Prophet's death.
We're talking about a few decades, really.
Yeah. Exactly. So following the era of the first four caliphs, the rightly guided caliphs, the system, which is based on consultation or shura and merit, was being replaced. And it was being replaced by a dynastic hereditary monarchy, a system called mulkiya. This was the radical political shift that Hussein was resisting.
So the core political conflict here was Yazid, the son of the previous ruler, Muawiyah, demanding the allegiance, or bay'ah, from Hussein. He needed it to legitimize his hereditary rule. The state needed this moral, this popular endorsement to solidify what was essentially an illegal shift in how the government worked.
Precisely. And that word bay'ah is so critical here. It's not just a handshake, it's not just a political endorsement. It's a sacred, voluntary, and constitutional oath of fealty and obedience. It establishes a kind of reciprocal contract between the ruler and the ruled.
A contract.
Yes. So if a figure of immense moral and religious authority, like Hussein, who was the grandson of the Prophet, remember, gave his bay'ah to Yazid, the hereditary rule would instantly gain this veneer of religious and political legality. It would normalize the monarchical transition. It would be the ultimate rubber stamp.
And his refusal is one of the most powerful constitutional statements in history, just loaded with political and legal weight. He says, "A man like me cannot pledge allegiance to a man like him."
That statement is, it's the ultimate rejection of de facto power that lacks de jure legitimacy. It's not arrogance. You have to see it as a legal codification of a belief. The belief that Yazid lacked the moral, the religious, and the political qualifications to hold power. And therefore, the entire political structure he represented was illegitimate.
So by saying a man like me, he's not just talking about himself.
No, he's speaking for a principle. He's asserting that those who uphold the principles of justice and constitutional morality cannot, ethically, submit to a government that is defined by injustice and coercion. It's a line in the sand.
So the source material really details that this refusal was about so much more than just a power struggle. This was a crisis centered on fundamental constitutional principles.
Absolutely. We can break down the issues at stake. First, you have the legitimacy of leadership. I mean, was the leader chosen by consultation by the community, or was he chosen by hereditary decree? That's a huge one.
The whole foundation of the state.
Exactly. Second, the limits of state power. Did the state have the authority to compel allegiance, to force you to agree, regardless of the ruler's character or how he came to power? Third, and this is the big one, the rejection of hereditary monarchy replacing shura, or consultation, which was the established method of selection. And finally, you have the independence of conscience. Hussain was essentially saying his moral integrity was not the state's property. It couldn't be traded for political stability.
And that highlights the critical tension here. Because the state needed his moral endorsement, his refusal destabilized the entire nascent regime. When he refused to provide that moral cover, the state immediately, and I mean immediately, resorted to force. It transformed a constitutional disagreement into an existential threat for them.
Yes. The state's logic quickly transitioned from, seeking submission to demanding eradication. And we see this so acutely in the systematic closure of all other options. You see it in the interception near Kufa, which culminates at Karbala. Hussain and his small caravan, we're talking about 72 people, including women and children, were met by an army of thousands of state soldiers.
And what really stands out in the accounts of that interception is how systematically the political containment escalated into outright tyranny. It just demonstrates the state's ultimate lack of any ethical constraint once it felt threatened.
The tactics were brutal, and they were designed to offer no recourse, no way out, water was cut off. I mean, think about that in the desert. It's a profoundly symbolic and physical act of denying basic human rights. It's treating them as criminals unworthy of life support.
It's a siege tactic.
It's a siege tactic against a family. Movement was restricted, completely preventing any retreat, any alternative route. They couldn't even go back the way they came. And crucially, negotiations were repeatedly denied, except under one impossible condition. Absolute, unconditional surrender to Yazid. Unconditional bay'ah.
This detail is so vital, isn't it? The state didn't want a political solution. They weren't looking for a compromise. They wanted a moral capitulation. By closing all pathways to peaceful compromise, they intentionally forced the confrontation, which then allowed them to brand dissent as treason.
And this is the universal hallmark of a state that fears conscience. It has to reclassify moral opposition as criminal treason. It's the ultimate escalation. It's the state saying, if you won't compromise your values, we will eliminate you as a political entity, and we will smear your legacy as a rebel.
And yet, even facing total annihilation, Hussain kept reiterating his core purpose. He declared at Karbala, "I did not come to seek power. I came only to reform the nation of my grandfather."
And that one quote just cuts through the state's entire narrative, right? The state wanted to brand him as a rebel, a political opportunist seeking worldly power.
Sure, he's just trying to seize the throne.
Exactly. By declaring his goal was reform, that it was about restoring ethical principles, not seizing the throne, he affirmed his moral superiority, even as he was physically surrounded and about to be destroyed.
The precedent set by his martyrdom is profound. The source material is clear that Karbala established this enduring standard that dissent is not synonymous with rebellion. That when the governance structure fails morally, resisting injustice ceases to be just an option. It becomes a fundamental duty.
And most powerfully, it proved that moral authority can ultimately defeat political authority. Even though the state won the battle, silencing the individual voice, it lost the constitutional argument for the next 1,300 years and counting.
It's this idea that you can kill the man, but not the principle.
Exactly. It's the ultimate statement that tyranny can manipulate law, it can declare dissent treason, it can cut off water, it can deploy thousands of soldiers, but it cannot manipulate conscience. Karbala was the first major watershed instance in Islamic history where the state openly criminalized dissent solely to maintain a political transition, overriding every moral and ethical constraint. It really sets the baseline for analyzing all subsequent struggles against unbridled state power.
It sounds like the transition from a merit-based system to a hereditary one required, almost by definition, the murder of conscience to secure its own legitimacy.
Precisely. And that insecurity is what makes the state so dangerous. When a regime knows its power is illegitimate, the first thing it seeks to destroy is the standard of integrity that exposes that illegitimacy.
Okay, let's unpack this and move across a millennia. We're shifting now from that 7th century monarchy crisis in the East to the original democratic crisis, the trial and execution of Socrates in 4th century BCE Athens. And here's where it gets really interesting, because we move from a refusal of constitutional allegiance to a refusal of intellectual conformity.
Right, the mechanism of coercion is different, but the intent of the state to silence a moral critic is identical. Socrates was put on trial in a city-state that prided itself on being the cradle of democracy, of law, of free debate. But we have to understand the historical context here.
It wasn't a stable, confident Athens.
No, not at all. Athens had just emerged from the devastating Peloponnesian War, and it was reeling from the brief but brutal rule of the oligarchic 30 tyrants who had overthrown the democracy. The democracy had only recently been restored.
That's vital context. So
What's
Athens was politically traumatized and desperately seeking stability. It wanted to return to the old ways, to tradition.
Exactly. Stability was prioritized over truth. And the formal charges leveled against Socrates, brought by Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon, they sound almost bizarre to modern ears. Corrupting the youth, questioning accepted beliefs, and inventing new gods. Impiety.
They sound religious, but the source material clarifies they were deeply political in nature.
They were the legal pretext. The reality was pure political and intellectual retribution, just veiled in religious terminology. Our research contrasts those formal charges with the actual reasons for his punishment. He was being punished for publicly critiquing the Athenian power elite, for challenging public opinion, the demos, and for consistently refusing to endorse political corruption or instability.
And most dangerously, for encouraging independent critical thought among the young men of Athens.
Right. And many of his former students, you have to remember, like Critias and Alcibiades, had been involved in the very political chaos that Athens was trying so desperately to forget. Critias was the leader of the 30 tyrants.
So his association with past political failures, combined with his kind of corrosive method of perpetual questioning, made his philosophy itself a threat to the fragile restored democracy.
His Socratic method, that relentless cross-examination of conventional wisdom, the refusal to accept superficial answers, it was fundamentally corrosive to the atmosphere of conformity that the traumatized state desperately required. The state needed loyalty and simple narratives. Socrates demanded radical truth and skepticism about everything, including the very basis of law and justice.
That makes the connection back to Hussain much clearer. Hussain exposed the illegitimacy of the new ruler. Socrates exposed the hypocrisy of the ruling masses and the laws they created.
And his moral stand is equally uncompromising as Hussein's refusal of the bay'ah. He refused to abandon his principles even when he was given a clear path to acquittal. He could have proposed a small fine. He could have agreed to stop teaching.
But he didn't.
No. He famously declared, "I will obey God rather than man."
This statement, delivered in Greek court, it just echoes that constitutional refusal in Arabia centuries later, doesn't it? It places a higher internal moral law, whether you call it divine mandate or rational ethical truth, above the temporary coercive law enacted by a fearful state.
He chose intellectual integrity over physical safety, fully understanding the consequences of refusing to recant or abandon his teaching. I mean, he asked the jury, in effect, what is the value of life if I cannot pursue the truth? He even proposed, as a counter penalty, that instead of a fine, the city should honor him with free meals for life at the Prytaneum, which was, an honor reserved for Olympic champions.
Which the jury would have seen as the ultimate act of defiance.
It was seen as mocking the court. And this brings us to the profound and deeply unsettling irony of this injustice. Socrates was sentenced to death not by a tyrant or a king, but by a jury of 501 of his fellow citizens in a democratic state.
This is the critical insight our comparative analysis reveals. Democracy offers no automatic immunity against injustice.
None at all. The sources highlight that a majority, when it's driven by fear, by resentment, and by a desire for scapegoating after a period of trauma, can weaponize the very legal system that was designed to protect freedoms. The democratic institution committed a grave injustice when the ruling body feared dissent and independent thinking more than it valued truth.
So the state weaponized its own legal mechanisms, voting, trial by jury, to silence a truth teller, just as the early Umayyad state used brute force to eliminate its moral challenger.
The common denominator is the state's reaction to a profound intellectual or moral challenge. Both Socrates and Hussain refused to compromise the truth. Both exposed the moral bankruptcy of authority, whether that authority was a monarchy seeking hereditary legitimacy or a democracy seeking stable conformity.
The cost of that refusal was catastrophic to them personally, but transcendent in history.
Their martyrdoms, one by force at Karbala and one by a legally sanctioned cup of poison in Athens, they both affirm that central principle. States collapse morally when they punish conscience instead of corruption. The state that feared the philosophical question lost its philosophical foundation, just as the regime that demanded allegiance by force lost its moral authority.
Okay, so now we make a huge leap to the 20th century. We're shifting the focus from individual resistance, Hussein, Socrates, to institutional failure. Specifically, the judiciary's role in sanctioning the unconstitutional seizure of power. This feels like the ultimate betrayal of the rule of law.
It is. This is a different flavor of state coercion, you're right. The failure isn't in an individual resisting power, but in a core state institution validating illegality. So post-independence Pakistan was characterized by extreme political turmoil, a lot of constitutional fragility. In 1958, the commander-in-chief, General Ayub Khan, imposed the country's first martial law. He overthrew the civilian government. That was the political act.
A straightforward coup.
A coup. A clear political act of brute force. But what truly cemented the crisis was the subsequent legal trauma. The Supreme Court of Pakistan, which was led by Chief Justice Muhammad Meer, was immediately tasked with validating this coup. The military act of seizing power desperately needed a legal rubber stamp, and the court delivered it through one of the most infamous legal concepts in Commonwealth history: the Doctrine of Necessity.
We really need to define that legal mechanism with precision, because it didn't just affect this one event. It became the foundation for decades of political instability and future coups, right?
It did. It created a playbook.
So what exactly does the Doctrine of Necessity stipulate, and how did Chief Justice Munir justify applying it?
At its core, it's a pragmatic doctrine. It holds that the preservation of the state, or maintaining what is perceived as stability, can justify actions that would otherwise be illegal or unconstitutional.
Breaking the law to save the country.
That's the logic. And the legal justification Chief Justice Munir used was rooted, ironically, in Western jurisprudence, specifically the theories of an Austrian legal scholar, Hans Kelsen, regarding revolutionary legality.
Kelsen's theory. This suggests that if a coup is successful, it effectively establishes a new Grund norm, or a new basic legal norm, which then makes the formerly illegal act legal. Basically, makes right, legally speaking.
That's a good way to put it. The court accepted that the revolution had been successful, and therefore a state of necessity existed to prevent what they saw as total chaos. Our source quotes the crucial, catastrophic judgment from the case. Necessity makes permissible what would otherwise be illegal. The court was essentially saying, since the existing legal system and the civilian government failed to govern and prevent chaos, breaking the law is now legally necessary because stability requires it.
That is the ultimate legal paradox. The court used the very legal system it was sworn to protect to justify tearing up the Constitution, which is the ultimate source of that legality. This decision gave comprehensive legal cover to the overthrow, to the suspension of fundamental rights, and to the concentration of all power in one man. It literally provided a judicial loophole for treason.
It was a judicial surrender disguised as legal pragmatism. The source material is very clear on this. This decision did not save the Constitution, it destroyed it. It ushered in an age of arbitrary rule. The courts prioritized institutional continuity, this idea that some form of government, even an illegal one, is better than no government at all over constitutional integrity. They were willing to sacrifice justice on the altar of stability.
And this is where we see the parallel to the ancient crises. The state, but this time via the judiciary, chose to punish the political dissent, the failure of the civilian government, by empowering the military strongman rather than upholding the moral integrity of the Constitution.
And the immediate and chilling consequences for dissent were profound. Once martial law was validated by the court, the environment fundamentally shifted. Political dissent became instantly and existentially dangerous. Opposition was systematically controlled. The civilian rule of law just evaporated, and it was replaced by the arbitrary fiat of the military ruler.
Because the Supreme Court, by invoking necessity, had essentially declared that power, not the Constitution, was the true law of the land.
Precisely. The legal environment mirrored the moral environment of Karbala and Athens. The institutions failed because they chose to reward silence and coercion while marginalizing truth and constitutional principles. The fear of chaos was greater than the commitment to justice.
And the doctrine of necessity didn't just validate the 1958 coup, it set a terrible, terrible precedent.
It created a blueprint, a roadmap for future coups. The source material emphasizes that this decision is widely regarded as the single greatest judicial error in Pakistan's history because it created this self-fulfilling prophecy, which was repeatedly invoked in subsequent military takeovers.
The painful lesson here, which echoes Hussein's stand and Socrates' commitment, is that a state that suppresses dissent, whether it's politically or legally, will eventually suppress justice itself. When the courts capitulate to convenience or necessity, the entire constitutional structure is hollowed out, creating decades of instability.
The ultimate takeaway from Pakistan's 1958 crisis is that the state doesn't need external enemies to collapse its justice system. It only needs an internal willingness to prioritize stability over law.
And the moral critic, the voice of conscience, becomes the ultimate inconvenient truth that must be silenced, or in this case, legally neutralized to maintain the new illegitimate order.
Exactly.
So we've analyzed three incredibly distinct events now. A refusal of allegiance that led to martyrdom in the 7th century, a refusal of philosophical conformity leading to execution in the 4th century BCE, and then this judicial surrender to military power in the 20th century. So what does this all mean? Let's stop looking at them linearly for a moment and start synthesizing the universal patterns revealed in the source material's comparative matrix.
All right, this is where we transition from history to political science and moral philosophy. We're comparing three distinct types of coercion and resistance. You have a political challenge to dynastic rule in Karbala, a philosophical challenge to democratic conformity in Athens, and an institutional challenge to constitutional rule in Pakistan. The fragility of the state is the key constant across all three.
Let's use the Deep Dive's comparative matrix to really systematically analyze the core dynamics. Let's focus on the nature of authority and the state's response. We can begin with the central act, the action or refusal itself.
Okay, so in Karbala you have Imam Hussain, an individual who stood up and refused coerced allegiance to an illegitimate regime. His action was constitutionally motivated. In Athens, you have Socrates, an individual who refused coerced conformity, choosing intellectual honesty and the pursuit of truth over life itself. This was ethically motivated. But in Pakistan, in 1958, the constitutional institution, the Supreme Court, it accepted coercion. It prioritized what it saw as continuity over the rule of law. So the refusal was the individual's triumph in the first two cases. The acceptance was the institution's catastrophic failure in the third.
It's really striking that the individual conscience held firm in both ancient examples, while the collective modern institution failed the test.
It is. And look at how opposition was treated in each case. The state's immediate move is always to reclassify the moral or legal challenge as a political crime. That's how they justify elimination. For Hussein, his dissent was instantly treated as military rebellion, which justified a full-scale slaughter.
Right.
For Socrates, his philosophy was treated as treason against the gods and the state, which justified a legal death sentence by a majority vote. And for Pakistan in 1958, political opposition and simply adhering to the Constitution were treated as threats to stability, which justified the abrogation of all rights under martial law with the blessing of the court.
The language changes. He's a rebel, he's impious, they're destabilizing. But the function is the same. Eliminate the critic, maintain power. Now, what about the source of power or justification that the state used in each case? This tells us a lot about the state's internal logic, I think.
It does. In Karbala, the nascent monarchy used overt, undeniable force. It was physical violence to impose obedience. It was a clear-cut confrontation of moral authority versus brute political power. In Athens, the democratic state used law. It used the democratic verdict, the vote of the citizens, to justify its punishment. So this was ethical truth versus established legal authority, which makes the injustice so ironically internal to the legal system itself.
And Pakistan.
And in Pakistan, 1958, martial law was imposed from outside the Constitution, and then the Supreme Court came in and blessed it using the doctrine of necessity. So here, power overrode constitutional law entirely.
The means of suppression evolved, didn't they? From raw violence to perverted law to, finally, judicial surrender. But the underlying motivation to crush any internal challenge to legitimacy, that remained constant. It was always easier to kill the critic than to fix the system they were criticizing.
And this leads us directly to the enduring and the very divergent legacies of these moments. Hussein's martyrdom became the eternal symbol of justice, of resistance, and the rejection of tyranny, particularly in the Islamic world. Socrates' death became the indelible symbol of free thought, of philosophical skepticism, and the vulnerability of the intellect to popular fear in the West.
And tragically, the Doctrine of Necessity in Pakistan 1958 became the persistent symbol of judicial surrender. It's a legacy that haunted the country for decades by creating a reliable legal framework for future unconstitutional overthrows.
The difference in legacy is poignant, isn't it? Two individuals achieved historical, moral victories through their deaths. One institution established a historical failure through its attempt at self-preservation. This contrast allows us to distill the ultimate legal and moral conclusion from these three events, what the source material called the ratio decidendi, the core deciding principle.
Which is, the state must not criminalize dissent. Legitimacy comes from justice, not coercion.
That is the universal law distilled from these tragedies. The state's fundamental duty is to protect the space for moral truth, even if that truth is uncomfortable, not to silence it for the sake of political continuity. Any structure, be it a monarchy, a democracy, or a modern republic, that prioritizes its own stability over justice is, by its very nature, unstable.
In synthesizing the long-term impact, we can see that Karbala set the standard for moral resistance. The Trial of Socrates formed the very foundation of Western political philosophy regarding dissent and free speech. And Pakistan's 1958 coup set decades of legal and political precedent for unconstitutional rule. They are profoundly interconnected lessons in power dynamics and state fragility.
And we can connect this even further. We can see three different types of state fragility revealed here. Karbala exposed the fragility of succession, the inability to transfer power legitimately. Socrates exposed the fragility of democracy, how easily popular fear can override reason and justice. And Pakistan in 1958 exposed the fragility of institutions, how quickly the judiciary can abandon its constitutional role when it's faced with the threat of chaos. All roads lead to the same destination, the suppression of conscience to mask a fundamental failure.
So we've come full circle.
Ultimately, the profound moral lesson that emerges from connecting these threads, from the dusty plains of Karbala to the ancient agora of Athens and the modern courtrooms of South Asia, is simple yet terrifying. A nation that punishes truth becomes a nation ruled entirely by fear and illegitimacy.
And conversely, a state that actively protects dissent, even dissent that is uncomfortable, inconvenient, or fundamentally critical of the state itself, that becomes a state ruled by justice, by confidence. The true measure of a state's health isn't its military power or its economic might, but how it treats its internal moral critics.
And the internal victory of integrity, at the end of the day, matters infinitely more than the immediate outcome of a political conflict. When Hussein was massacred or Socrates was forced to drink the hemlock, they lost the moment. They lost their lives. But in the long arc of history, their conscience won. It reshaped the moral standards of their respective civilizations and inspired generations of resistance. Their deaths made the systems that killed them morally infamous.
That leaves us with a provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. We have seen historical figures make the ultimate sacrifice, and we've seen modern institutions fail this test. And the principles established in these three trials, they remain intensely relevant to our lives today. They demand continuous vigilance regarding constitutional morality.
So ask yourself, what modern institutions today, whether they are democratic, corporate, or legal, might be prioritizing continuity or convenience or cohesion over justice and truth? Where is the modern doctrine of necessity being applied to silence voices that reveal inconvenient truths about corruption or mismanagement? The stand against coercion is not just an ancient story. It is a permanent moral requirement for citizenship.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the difficult history of conscience versus the state.
Until next time.